Commander Xylith stood in the command center watching her world burn, and the sky above Velthara glowed red from the fires that consumed her cities, while 300 Kryn warships descended like hungry predators, circling wounded prey. And she knew with absolute certainty that her species had only hours left before complete extinction, and the holographic displays showed nothing but death approaching from every angle, and her officers moved through their duties with the hollow efficiency of people who had accepted their fate, and she wanted to scream at the injustice of it all. But commanders did not scream, even when watching their entire civilization die. The Galactic Coalition had received their distress call 3 days ago, and 47 member species had sworn mutual defense and promised that no member world would ever face extinction alone. And yet the sensor arrays showed nothing but empty space where allied fleets should have gathered, and Xylith had sent 17 more requests for assistance and received only automated acknowledgement signals. And the silence from the galaxy spoke louder than any words could, and her people had trusted the coalition and paid their dues and followed every regulation, and now they would die alone while the bureaucrats on distant paradise worlds debated proper diplomatic protocols. Parvin approached with his head lowered in the Keltharian gesture of despair, and his voice carried the weight of someone delivering a death sentence, and he said, "Commander, the last defense satellite has fallen, and the Kryn are beginning systematic bombardment of population centers, and at current rates we have 4 hours before the capital is targeted." And she nodded because there was nothing else to do and nowhere left to run, and their ships were destroyed and their weapons were depleted, and the great coalition that promised protection had abandoned them without explanation or apology. The communications officer suddenly straightened, and his vocal crest flared in confusion, and he said, "Commander, we are receiving a transmission, and it is not Coalition standard protocol, and the language database identifies it as English." And Xylith felt her secondary heart skip because English was not a language spoken by any Coalition species, and the database search returned results that made her blood chill, and it showed a restricted entry for a quarantined world and a species classification that read Deathworld status, and the species name was human. And every officer in the command center knew what Deathworld meant, because those stories were told to children as warnings about the dangerous places in the galaxy where evolution turned cruel. Deathworld species evolved on planets so hostile that merely surviving to adulthood required abilities that terrified civilized races, and the Coalition kept 3 such species under permanent quarantine and locked in their home systems and forbidden from contact with the peaceful species of the galaxy, and humans were one of those 3. And the story said they came from a planet that actively tried to kill its inhabitants through weather and predators and diseases and geological instability, and the humans had not only survived but thrived and become the dominant species on a world that should have been impossible to colonize. And the Coalition had taken one look at humanity and decided they were too dangerous to ever leave their solar system. Xylith ordered the communications officer to play the message, and the voice that emerged from the speakers carried an edge that made every Keltharian in the room instinctively activate their defensive plates, and it was rough and confident and completely unafraid. And the voice said, "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the human ship Liberty's End, and we intercepted your distress call, and we know the Coalition abandoned you, and we are 3 hours out from your position with a fleet of 47 ships, and we are not your allies because the galaxy will not let us be allies with anyone, but we are coming anyway because humanity does not leave people to die alone." The transmission ended, and the command center fell into stunned silence, and Parvin whispered 47 ships against 300, and they must be insane. And Xylith thought about the military academy lectures on Deathworld species, and how they saw danger differently than civilized beings, and how they evolved under conditions that would kill normal species in moments, and how they formed bonds not through careful diplomacy, but through something they called loyalty, and how the Coalition feared them, not because they were evil, but because they were unpredictable and willing to fight when peaceful species would negotiate. She made her decision quickly because her people had nothing left to lose, and she ordered all remaining defensive positions to prepare for coordination with unknown allies, and she told her officers to pray to their ancestors that the humans were as dangerous as the stories claimed. And Parvin asked, "What if they are more dangerous than the stories?" And Xylith replied, "Then perhaps we have a chance." and the command center erupted into frantic activity as her people prepared to witness something no Keltharian had ever seen before, and the sensors showed the human fleet approaching at speeds that should have torn their ships apart, and she wondered what kind of beings could survive such acceleration and what kind of ships could endure such stress. The Kryn continued their bombardment, unaware that the rules of engagement were about to change, and their admiral probably expected either coalition negotiators or total surrender. And instead he was about to encounter something far worse, and Xylith pulled up everything her database had on humans, and the information was sparse because the quarantine had been in place for over a century, and most of what existed were warnings and cautionary notes, and one entry caught her attention, and it said, "Human warfare doctrine does not follow conventional patterns, and they prefer close combat over distance fighting, and they build ships to absorb damage rather than avoid it, and their psychology is adapted for sustained conflict in adverse conditions, and recommend avoiding engagement at all costs." She read that last line again and thought about the irony that the only species willing to help them was the same species the galaxy had locked away, and she wondered if the coalition had made a terrible mistake and trapped the very allies they might someday need. And the censor officer called out that the human fleet had entered the system, and their formation made no tactical sense by conventional standards, and they were spreading out in an asymmetrical pattern that left gaps everywhere, and any military academy instructor would have failed them for such poor coordination, and yet something about it felt deliberate and predatory. Xylith watched the displays as 47 crude-looking ships moved toward 300 elegant Kryn warships, and the size difference was staggering, and the technology gap should have been insurmountable, and by every measure this should have been a massacre. And she realized the massacre might not go the way everyone expected, and she opened a channel to all Keltharian forces and said, "Hold your positions and watch what Deathworld veterans can do and prepare to support them however possible." And her officers acknowledged with renewed hope in their voices, because someone had come and someone was willing to fight. And even if they all died, at least they would die fighting, instead of waiting for the end. The human fleet accelerated toward the Kryn, and Xylith saw one ship break formation and surge ahead of the others, and its profile was ugly and brutal, and looked like it had been assembled from mining equipment and scrap metal, and the database identified it as the Frontier's Promise, and the ship was moving at velocities that violated every safety protocol ever written, and its hull should have buckled from the structural stress, and yet it held together through sheer bloody-minded engineering, and Xylith realized the humans built their ships the same way they survived their planet, and they over-engineered everything and assumed damage was inevitable and planned accordingly. Captain Morrison's voice came through again, and he said, "Keltharian Command, this is Morrison, and hold your ground and protect your people, and we will handle the Kryn." And his tone was casual, like he was discussing weather, instead of facing impossible odds. And Xylith replied, "We stand ready to assist, Captain," and he laughed and said, "Just stay alive, Commander, and watch what happens when someone picks a fight with Earth and the transmission cut off." And the Frontier's Promise reached the Kryn fleet, and what happened next would be talked about in military academies for generations. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of Liberty's End, watching Velthera grow larger in the viewport, and his crew moved with practiced efficiency around him, and these were people who had grown up in environments that would kill most species instantly, and they had learned to treat danger as just another problem to solve. And Lieutenant Carla Hughes sat at tactical running checks on weapon systems that had never been designed for combat, and she called out that the Kryn fleet maintained orbital bombardment pattern, and they had not noticed the human approach yet, and their energy signatures matched plasma cascaders and molecular disruptors, and Jake recognized those as mining tools adapted for warfare and weapons meant to break apart rocks and buildings and unarmored populations. Commander Danny Foster pulled up tactical displays showing all 47 human vessels spread across space in a formation that would have made coalition tacticians weep, and it was deliberately chaotic and unpredictable and built on the assumption that half their ships would not survive the first engagement. And Danny confirmed that everyone was in position, and the mining vessels were ready, and Lisa Chen on the Frontier's Promise had her surprise package armed and ready, and Jake allowed himself a thin smile because the galaxy was about to learn what humanity had been doing during their century of forced isolation. Jake had grown up on Mars Colony 7, where a single equipment failure meant everyone in your section died, and he had lost friends to decompression accidents and radiation leaks and simple bad luck, and he had learned young that survival meant preparation and redundancy, and never trusting that things would work the way they were supposed to. And every human in the fleet had similar stories, and they came from asteroid mining operations, where solar flares could kill you in seconds, and deep space construction projects where one mistake meant drifting into the void and colony worlds where the environment was hostile and unforgiving. And they had all learned the same lesson that Earth herself had taught humanity. And that lesson was simple and brutal, and it said the universe does not care if you live or die, so you better care enough for both. He ordered Pete Sullivan to open a channel to all ships, and Pete nodded, and his fingers danced across controls, and Jake took a breath thinking about the message that had reached them a week ago, and a desperate plea from a species humanity had never met and abandoned by the same coalition that kept humanity locked behind quarantine walls, and the coalition called Earth a Deathworld, and humans too savage for civilized space, and they had spent 150 years telling humanity they were too dangerous and too violent and too unpredictable. And now those same qualities were about to save an entire species. Jake spoke clearly into the open channel and said, "This is Morrison. To all ships, and in about 5 minutes we are going to announce ourselves to those Kryn vessels, and they outnumber us 6 to 1. And their ships are military grade, and ours are retrofitted mining boats and colony haulers, and by every tactical assessment we should not even slow them down." And he paused, letting the words settle, and he could see his bridge crew grinning because they knew what came next, and they had heard this speech before in different forms, and it never got old. He continued and said, "But here is what the Kryn do not know. And they evolved on a paradise world where the greatest danger was bad weather, and they have fought wars, but their version of war is fleet actions, at comfortable distances with shields and long-range weapons, and they have never had to fight like we fight, and they do not know what it means to grow up on a planet trying to kill you from birth, and they do not understand that humanity learned warfare from Earth itself, and the same planet that throws hurricanes and earthquakes and tsunamis at us just for existing." And his voice hardened, and he said, "We are the descendants of people who looked at a world covered in hostile life and extreme weather, and 1,000 ways to die, and we did not just survive, and we thrived, and we turned survival into an art form." The cheers echoed across the open channel from all 47 ships, and Jake felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that every human knew, and the same chemical response that kept their ancestors alive through ice ages and predators and every disaster Earth could throw at them. And he ordered Carla to bring them in fast and close, and told Danny to have Lisa let the Kryn see Frontier's promise first, and give them a proper human greeting. And his officers responded with crisp acknowledgments, and the Liberty's End accelerated toward the Kryn fleet, and Jake Morrison felt alive in a way that only happened when facing impossible odds. The Kryn Admiral Krynoth sat comfortable in his command ship, watching the resource extraction proceed according to schedule, and Velthara's crystal deposits were proving even more valuable than surveys indicated, and the Keltharian resistance had collapsed within hours, and now it was simply methodical planetary harvest, and his sensor officer reported energy signatures entering the system, and 47 vessels of unknown configuration, and Krynoth's facial tendrils curled in amusement, thinking the coalition finally responded, and how typical they waited until the outcome was decided, and he ordered identification of the fleet composition. His sensor officer hesitated and said, "Admiral, they are not coalition vessels, and the design language is completely unfamiliar, and energy signatures are inefficient and crude, and they appear to be industrial ships and possibly mining vessels." And Krynoth's amusement turned to puzzlement, because why would mining vessels approach an active battle zone? And he ordered communications to hail them and explain this system was now under Kryn jurisdiction. And before his officer could comply, one of the approaching vessels accelerated to speeds that made his sensor officer gasp in alarm, and the structural stress alone should have torn the ship apart. The vessel was massive and ugly, and looked assembled from scrap metal and desperation, and it roared past the Kryn outer picket line so close its drive wash disrupted shield harmonics. And as it passed, it broadcast a message in perfect Kryn language, and the voice said, "Attention Kryn Imperial Fleet. And this is the human vessel Frontier's Promise. and you are engaged in genocide and withdraw immediately or face consequences. And Krynoth pulled up his database searching for human, and the entry was small and flagged with multiple warnings, and it said, Species from Quarantine Zone 7 and Deathworld classification and restricted from contact by coalition order. He stared at the warnings and asked how 47 industrial ships thought they could threaten 300 Kryn warships, and it was insulting. And he ordered his weapons officer to target that vessel and destroy it, and teach these humans the cost of interfering, and 20 Kryn ships locked weapons and fired, and plasma cascaders and molecular disruptors lanced across space in enough firepower to vaporize a coalition cruiser, and Krynoth expected the human ship to simply cease existing. Instead, the Frontier's promise accelerated directly into the weapons fire, and its hull absorbed the impacts and armor that thick should not be possible, and the weight alone would make maneuvering impossible. But the ship was not slowing, and if anything, it accelerated faster, and its hull glowed with heat but remained structurally intact, and Krynoth felt something unfamiliar. And it took him a moment to recognize the feeling as fear, and he ordered all forward batteries to concentrate fire, and 50 more ships added their weapons, and space ignited with concentrated firepower. The Frontier's promise kept coming, and at the last moment when collision seemed inevitable, the human ship rotated and fired its main engines directly at the closest Kryn vessels. And the drive wash was not just exhaust, and it was a focused torch of superheated plasma designed to break apart asteroids, and 3 Kryn destroyers simply vaporized, and Krynoth screamed evasive action, but too late, and the Frontier's promise swept through his forward line like a blade, and her engines turned his formation into chaos. And then the other 46 human ships arrived, and they came fast and low, and ignored all conventional tactics, and charged in close where their heavy armor gave advantage and where their ships could use physical ramming as weapons. The battle became chaos within seconds, and human ships moved through Kryn formations like predators among prey, and they pulled maneuvers that should have killed everyone aboard from acceleration forces alone, and coalition species would have been turned to paste, but humans had dense bone structure and redundant cardiovascular systems, and they evolved to survive injuries that would kill civilized beings, and their ships reflected that same philosophy, and every system had backups, and every backup had backups, and they did not trust single-point failures because Earth had taught them better. Carla called out targets, and Danny coordinated fleet movements, and Jake watched 2 human vessels bracket a Kryn cruiser and literally tear it apart with magnetic grapples designed for moving asteroids, and the Kryn returned fire, and their weapons were sophisticated, and their targeting was precise, but human ships just absorbed the damage and kept coming, and Jake saw the mining vessel Rocky Mountain take a direct hit that punched through her forward armor, and she vented atmosphere and lost 2 compartments. But her crew sealed the breach and kept fighting, and that was the human way, and you took your hits, and you kept moving, and you never stopped. The Kryn were learning a terrible lesson, and their military doctrine assumed enemies would maintain proper distance and use shields for protection and fight, according to established conventions. But humans had no conventions, because they came from a world without rules, and Earth did not care about proper combat distance, and hurricanes did not wait for you to raise shields, and earthquakes did not follow tactical doctrine, and humanity learned to fight from a planet. That was itself a weapon, and they brought that philosophy to space, and their ships were built like Earth itself, and brutal and unforgiving, and absolutely relentless. Jake ordered Liberty's End into a close pass on a Kryn battleship, and Carla fired their main weapon, which was actually a mining laser designed to cut through solid rock, and the beam sliced into the Kryn ship's elegant hull and tore through compartments, and the Kryn vessel tried to return fire, but Liberty's End was already past and moving to the next target. And Pete reported the Kryn were broadcasting distress signals, and Admiral Krynoth was ordering a fighting retreat, and Jake felt satisfaction because the Kryn were learning, and they outnumbered humanity 6-1, and they had superior technology and better weapons. But none of that mattered because humans fought with a desperation born from living on a Deathworld commander. Xylith watched from her command center, and her analysts frantically tried to understand the combat data, and their voices overlapped in confusion and awe, and one analyst reported the humans were using mining ships as close combat vessels and ramming Kryn cruisers with reinforced hulls, and another added their shielding was almost non-existent, and they relied purely on armor thickness and damage redundancy. And a third analyst said the Frontier's promise survived concentrated fire that should have destroyed it 15 times over. And Xylith realized the humans did not build ships expecting shields to protect them, and they built ships expecting to take damage and keep fighting. And that was the Deathworld way. The Kryn fleet began pulling back, and their formation collapsed as human ships pressed the attack. And Jake knew better than to pursue too far because his ships were tough, but not invincible, and they had taken damage and lost crew. And the Rocky Mountain was barely holding together. And 3 other vessels reported critical systems failures, but they had done the impossible, and they had driven off a fleet 6 times their size using nothing but mining equipment and colony ships, and sheer bloody-minded determination. And Jake ordered his fleet to hold position around Velthera, and let the Kryn retreat, and they had made their point. He opened a channel to Commander Xylith, and her face appeared on his screen, and she looked at him with an expression mixing gratitude and fear and something else, and maybe respect, and she said, "Captain Morrison, you saved my species from extinction, and I must ask why and your people have been quarantined for over a century. And we Keltharians voted to maintain that quarantine. And why would you risk your lives for us?" And Jake considered his answer carefully because this moment mattered, and what he said now would echo across the galaxy. He replied with 3 reasons, and first, because it was the right thing to do. And second, because we are tired of being treated like monsters by a galaxy that claims to value life while abandoning entire species to genocide. And third, because we knew if the Coalition could abandon you, they would eventually abandon others, and we are not fighting for you. Specifically, Commander. And we are fighting for the principle that intelligent beings do not leave others to die. And Xylith looked down, and he could see shame in her posture. And she said, "You speak truly, and I voted for your quarantine, and we all did. And the stories about Deathworld species, and the fear that you would be too violent." Jake said, "Too dangerous, and yeah, we know." And the Coalition looked at humanity and saw a species that evolved fighting for survival every day, and they saw our history of warfare and decided we were savages, who needed to be locked away, and they did not bother to ask why we fight, and they did not care. That the same drive that makes us dangerous is the same drive that makes us show up when everyone else runs away. And a new voice cut into the channel, and it was cold and carried bureaucratic authority, and it said, "This is Coalition Arbiter Selkin, and human vessels, you are in violation of Quarantine Order 4827B, and you will cease all hostile actions and return to your designated system." Immediately, Jake felt anger rise but kept his voice level and said, "Arbiter Selkin, and how convenient of you to show up after the fighting is done. And where was the Coalition fleet when the Kryn invaded? And where were the 47 member species who swore mutual defense?" And Selkin responded that the Coalition was engaged in diplomatic negotiations with the Kryn Empire, and your intervention disrupted a carefully planned peaceful resolution. And Xylith could not contain her outrage and said, "Peaceful resolution, and they were exterminating my people." And Selkin continued as if she had not spoken, and said the situation was being addressed through proper channels. "And Captain Morrison, your actions constitute an act of war, and the Coalition cannot permit a quarantined species to engage in military operations outside their designated zone." Jake looked directly at the camera and said, "Let me make something clear. Arbiter and humanity just fought off a fleet 6 times our size using mining equipment and colony ships, and we did what your entire Coalition could not or would not do. And now you are threatening us, and here is my counteroffer. And you can try to enforce your quarantine and send your fleets and see what happens when you attack the people who just saved one of your member species, or you can step back and realize the galaxy just changed." And Selkin said, "Captain Morrison, you cannot threaten the Coalition." And Jake replied, "I am not threatening anyone, and I am stating facts, and humanity is done being locked away like criminals, and we have proven we can be trusted to do what the Coalition apparently cannot, and actually help people who need it." The channel went silent, and finally Selkan spoke with careful neutrality and said the Coalition Council will convene to discuss this matter, and until a decision is reached, all parties are to maintain current positions, and the transmission ended. And Jake and Xylith looked at each other across the void, and she said softly, "You just challenged the entire Galactic Coalition, and they will not forgive this." And Jake smiled, but it was not happy, and he said, Commander, humanity spent 150 years locked in our solar system watching the galaxy beyond our reach, and we used that time well, and we built ships to survive in conditions that would kill most species, and we trained in environments that would be classified as war crimes by coalition standards, and we prepared for the day when the quarantine would end or we would break it ourselves. He leaned forward and said the coalition thought they were protecting the galaxy from us, and what they actually did was give us time to become more dangerous than they imagined, and now they will learn what happens when you corner a Deathworld species and expect them to stay cornered. And Xylith felt gratitude and dread because humanity saved her world, but also shattered the political order that governed the galaxy for millennia. And she asked what happens now, and Jake said, now we find out if the galaxy is ready for humanity to join the fight, and like it or not, we are not going back into quarantine. And the galaxy needs people willing to fight for what is right, even when the odds are impossible, and especially when the odds are impossible. 3 cycles after the Battle of Velthara, the Coalition Council convened an emergency session on Neutral Station Harmony's Gate, and representatives from all 47 member species gathered in the Grand Council chamber, and their voices raised in heated debate, but this time there was additional presence in 5 human delegates standing calmly in the observer section, and uninvited but impossible to remove, and Ambassador Laura Bennett led the human delegation, and her gray hair and weathered face testified to a lifetime spent on frontier colonies. And she stood with casual confidence of someone who survived habitat breaches and solar flares, and general hostility of space itself. Arbiter Selkin addressed the chamber and said, "We are here to address unauthorized military action taken by quarantined species designation human, and they violated sacred protocols that maintained galactic peace for 2,000 years, and Commander Xylith interrupted from the Keltharian delegation and said they saved my entire species from genocide, and while the coalition debated and negotiated, the Kryn murdered millions of my people, and where were our allies, and where was the mutual defense treaty we all signed?" And Selkan countered that the situation required delicate diplomatic handling, and the humans' violent intervention escalated tensions and undermined careful negotiations. Xylith shot back and said negotiations that would have ended with my species extinct, and Velthara stripped bare, and I was there. Arbiter and I watched Kryn fleet bomb my cities while the coalition sent strongly worded messages, and the humans acted, and Laura Bennett raised her hand, and despite having no official recognition, the chamber fell silent, and there was something about how she carried herself that demanded attention, and she said, "If I may, and the Arbiter is correct, and we violated the quarantine, and we engaged in military action without coalition approval, and these are facts, and what the Arbiter seems reluctant to acknowledge is why we did it." She walked forward into the center of chamber, where only recognized speakers were permitted, and several security officers moved to intercept, but Selkin waved them off, because the entire galaxy watched this session, and forcibly removing the human ambassador would look worse than letting her speak. And Laura continued and said, "Humanity was quarantined 150 years ago, and the coalition looked at our planet and classified it as Deathworld and examined our history and decided we were too dangerous to interact with civilized space, and they saw our weapons and our conflicts and our competitive nature and labeled us savages, and you know what? And they were not entirely." Wrong murmurs rippled through chamber, and Laura pressed on and said, "Earth is a difficult planet and prone to earthquakes and tsunamis and hurricanes and extreme weather, and it has predators that can kill us in seconds and diseases and parasites, and 1,000 different hazards, and yes, we evolved to be aggressive and competitive and violent, because on Earth anything less means death, and we learned to fight, because our planet demanded it, and we developed technology, because we needed it, to survive, and we became warriors because we had no other choice." And she turned slowly, making eye contact with representatives around chamber, and said, "But here is what the coalition missed when they locked us away." She continued, and said the same environment that made us dangerous also made us loyal. And when you grow up on a world constantly trying to kill you, then you learn survival depends on working together. And you learn that when someone is in trouble, you help them, because someday, you will be the one who needs help, and you learn. There are principles worth fighting for even when not convenient or safe. And Laura's voice grew stronger, and she said the coalition represents 47 species, from paradise worlds where greatest danger is perhaps a storm or mild predator, and you created civilization based on calm deliberation and careful diplomacy, and that is admirable. But when Kryn came with their fleet, your calm deliberation meant nothing, and your careful diplomacy could not stop bombs falling on Keltharian cities. Selkin protested weakly and said we would have reached an agreement, and Laura countered, you would have reached agreement after Keltharians were dead, and that is the fundamental problem with the coalition, and you built society so focused on avoiding conflict that you forgot how to confront genuine evil. And when Kryn violated every principle you claimed to hold dear, you negotiated, and when they committed genocide you debated, and when they ignored your words you did nothing. And she paused, letting words sink in, and said humanity acted because we understand something the coalition has forgotten. And sometimes violence is necessary and not preferred and not desired but necessary, and sometimes the only way to stop evil is to punch it in the face. And Hart, a representative from Pelthoran delegation, said, you speak of violence so casually, and this is exactly why your species was quarantined, and you glorify conflict. And Laura replied, calmly, we do not glorify it, and we understand it, and there is a difference, and every human knows the cost of violence, and we have paid it throughout our history. But we also know the cost of pacifism when facing those who respect nothing but force. And the Kryn were not going to stop because you asked nicely. And they stopped because 47 mining ships and colony vessels fought them to a standstill. And Jake Morrison appeared on main display screen transmitting from Liberty's End in orbit above Velthera. Jake said Ambassador Bennett speaks truth, and human fleet is still here protecting Keltharian space because Kryn have not given up, and they are regrouping and planning another assault. And where is coalition fleet? And still debating. And Selkin bristled and said the coalition has dispatched defensive force and they will arrive within standard week. And Jake said flatly a week. And Kryn will attack in 3 days, according to our intelligence, and will your defensive force arrive before or after second genocide attempt? And the chamber erupted in argument, and some species supported humans grateful for intervention, and others demanded they return to quarantine, terrified of what Deathworld species might do with freedom to operate in galactic space. Laura waited for noise to subside and said the coalition has choice to make, and you can try to force humanity back into quarantine, and in which case you will learn exactly how difficult it is to fight species that considers adverse conditions normal, or you can accept that galaxy has changed and that there is now species willing to do what you cannot, and stand between evil and its victims regardless of cost. And Selkin said you cannot dictate terms to coalition, but his voice lacked conviction, and Laura replied, we are not dictating terms, and we are stating reality, and humanity is not going back into quarantine, and we are here, and we have proven our value, and we are not leaving, and you can work with us or against us, but you cannot ignore us, and not anymore. Xyleth stood again and said the Keltharian delegation proposes immediate revision of Quarantine Order 4827B, and humanity has demonstrated both military capability and moral character, and they saved my species when Coalition abandoned us, and I move. They be granted provisional membership in Coalition with full rights and protections. And the chamber exploded into chaos, and Laura stood calmly in center of it all and waiting, and it took 2 more cycles of debate. But eventually vote came, and 31 species voted to revoke humanity's quarantine and grant provisional membership, and 12 voted against and 4 abstained. As results were announced, Laura allowed herself small smile, and it was not complete victory. And quarantine had been revised, not eliminated, and humanity would face restrictions and oversight for years to come. But they achieved impossible, and they forced Galaxy to acknowledge them not as monsters, to be feared, but as allies to be respected. And Jake Morrison's voice came through her communication device and said, Ambassador, we have confirmation, and Kryn fleet is moving toward Velthera again, and looks like they are bringing reinforcements, and twice the size of first attack. And Laura's smile vanished, and she said coalition response, and Jake replied, their defensive force will not arrive for another 4 days, and we are on our own again. Laura looked up at Arbiter Selkin and said it. Seems humanity's trial by fire is not over, and Arbiter, my people are about to engage Kryn fleet twice the size of one they just defeated. And when this is over, and when we have once again done what Coalition could not, then I expect our provisional status to become permanent, and I expect formal apologies to be issued. And Selkan said quietly, "If you survive," and Laura replied, "We are from Earth, and survival is what we do best," and she turned and walked out of chamber, and her delegation following. And they had battle to prepare for and galaxy to teach that Deathworld veterans did not back down from impossible odds. And they embraced them. Above Velthara, the human fleet prepared to face impossible odds once more, and 47 ships against 600 Kryn warships, and by any rational assessment, humanity was about to be wiped out. But rational assessments did not account for determination of people who grew up on planet that threw everything at them and lost. And the Kryn were about to learn what coalition was just beginning to understand. And when you corner Deathworld species, and when you give them something worth fighting for, they do not surrender and they win. And Liberty's End and her sister ships moved into defensive formation around Velthara, and their crews calm and ready. Jake Morrison looked at his tactical display and felt familiar surge of adrenaline, and same chemical response that kept his species alive through countless challenges. And he transmitted to all ships and said, "Remember why we are here, and not for glory, and not for conquest, but because when no allies came to help Keltharians, we chose to be the allies they needed. And now let us show Galaxy what humanity does best, and let us survive the impossible." And again, and Kryn fleet emerged from hyperspace, and Second Battle of Velthara began, and what followed was 3 days of continuous combat that would be studied in military academies for generations. The Kryn came with overwhelming force and 600 warships against 47 battered human vessels, and they expected quick victory and complete annihilation of the upstart Deathworld species. But they had not learned the most important lesson about humanity, and humans did not fight like civilized species, and they did not respect conventional tactics, and they did not care about proper combat doctrine, and they fought like Earth itself, and relentless and brutal and absolutely refusing to quit. And the human ships were already damaged from first battle and systems failing and armor breached in dozen places. But they held their position and protected Veltharan space with stubborn determination. Jake coordinated defense from Liberty's End, and his ship had taken severe damage, and forward sections were sealed off, and life support running at 60%, and weapon systems cycling on manual control. Because automated systems were destroyed, but she still flew and still fought, and that was enough. And Carla called out targets through smoke-filled bridge, and Danny managed fleet coordination while simultaneously running damage control, and Pete kept communications open despite losing main antenna array. And the crew worked with efficiency, born from knowing failure meant death, and not just their death, but death of entire Keltharian species. The mining vessel, Rocky Mountain, finally succumbed to accumulated damage on day 2, and her captain ordered evacuation, and the crew transferred to nearby vessels, and she died protecting convoy of Keltharian evacuation ships, and her sacrifice bought time for 3,000 civilians to reach safety, and the colony transport New Horizon lost main engines and could not maneuver. But her captain refused to abandon position, and she used her ship as stationary weapons platform until Kryn torpedoes finally broke through her armor, and she took 40 Kryn fighters with her, and the deep space explorer Far Wanderer took direct hit from Kryn battleship main cannon, and should have been destroyed instantly. But human engineering meant she broke apart instead of vaporizing, and her crew survived. Long enough for rescue, Jake watched his fleet diminish and 7 ships lost, and every remaining vessel damaged beyond what should have been survivable. And his people kept fighting, and they improvised solutions and rerouted power and patched holes with whatever materials they could find, and humans were good at improvisation, because Earth taught them to adapt or die, and they adapted. And when weapons failed, they used mining tools. And when mining tools failed, they used their ships as weapons. And when their ships failed, they evacuated to other vessels and kept fighting. And the Kryn could not understand this. And how do you defeat enemy that refuses to acknowledge defeat? Commander Xylith watched from her command center, and her species was witnessing something they never imagined possible, and humans fighting against odds that should have been insurmountable, and doing impossible through sheer refusal to give up. And her people had stories about legendary warriors from their ancient past, and heroes who held impossible positions, and champions who defended the weak. And now those stories were real and happening in their orbit, and her analysts stopped trying to explain tactical data and simply watched in awe as humans demonstrated what Deathworld evolution actually meant. On day 3, the Kryn Admiral Krynoth made critical mistake, and he had assumed humans were like civilized species, and assumed they had breaking point, and assumed enough pressure would make them retreat, and he committed his remaining forces in massive assault, designed to overwhelm human defenses and crush them completely. And instead, he learned humans had no breaking point, and pressure made them more dangerous, and the human fleet absorbed his assault and counterattacked with ferocity that shocked his officers, and they had been fighting for 3 days and should have been exhausted and demoralized and defeated, and instead they fought harder. Jake saw the Kryn commitment and recognized opportunity, and he ordered all ships to focus fire on command vessels and target Kryn leadership and coordination, and human ships drove into heart of Kryn formation and ignored escorts and pressed directly toward command carriers, and it was suicidal by any conventional measure, and several more human vessels were destroyed in the push. But they reached their targets, and when mining lasers and improvised weapons could not penetrate command carrier shields, the colony transport Freedoms Call simply rammed her target at full speed, and her captain and crew died instantly. But the command carrier was crippled, and Kryn coordination collapsed. The battle turned in that moment, and Kryn fleet lost cohesion, and human ships pressed advantage, and they were down to 40 vessels and all damaged and barely functional. But they kept fighting, and Krynoth watched his fleet break apart, and realized he was fighting enemy that would rather die than lose, and rather sacrifice everything than abandon principles, and he had brought 600 ships against 47, and he was losing, and the mathematics made no sense, and the tactics were insane, and yet humans were winning through sheer impossible determination. Krynoth ordered full retreat, and his remaining forces broke contact and fled system, and human fleet did not pursue because they physically could not, and most ships running on backup power, and several losing life support, and all of them held together by improvised repairs and crew determination, and Jake slumped in his command chair and felt exhaustion wash over him, and 3 days of continuous combat and no sleep and running on adrenaline and duty, and now finally able to stop, and his crew collapsed at their stations and alive and victorious against all probability. When Coalition Defensive Force finally arrived, they found human fleet still holding position, and crews working around clock to repair battle damage with same stubborn determination that won them fight, and Coalition commanders watched sensor data showing wreckage of Kryn fleet scattered across system and 40 human vessels battered beyond recognition, but still functional and still protecting Keltheran space and the Coalition. Officers looked at each other in disbelief because this should not have been possible. And yet it happened, and humans did impossible. Because they did not know it was impossible. Ambassador Laura Bennett arrived with Coalition fleet, and she surveyed the aftermath and saw human ships that should have been scrap and crews that should have been dead, and species that should have been defeated. And instead she saw victory, and she saw humanity proving their worth in a way that could not be denied or dismissed, and she transmitted message to Jake and said, "Captain Morrison, you did it again, an impossible odds and unlikely victory. And the galaxy is watching, and the galaxy is learning." And Jake responded with exhaustion in his voice and said, "Ambassador, we did what needed to be done, and nothing more and nothing less." And Laura smiled and said, "Captain, that is exactly why humanity deserves place in this galaxy, and you do not fight for glory, and you fight because it is right." The Coalition Council reconvened within a week, and vote was unanimous this time, and humanity's quarantine was officially ended, and provisional membership became full membership, and formal apologies were issued to human delegation, and new defense treaties were drafted, and humans were invited to share their combat doctrine and training methods, and the galaxy began slow process of accepting that Deathworld species were not threat to be feared, but allies to be valued, and partners who would stand when others fled, and fighters who understood that some principles were worth dying for. Jake Morrison stood on observation deck of Liberty's End looking down at Velthera, and the planet was scarred but alive, and her people were rebuilding and surviving, because humans had chosen to help and had chosen to fight and had chosen to do what Coalition could not. And he thought about Earth and the planet that made humanity what they were, and the harsh, unforgiving world that taught them strength and resilience and loyalty. And he understood now why Earth was the way it was, and hostile environment was not curse but gift. And it created species capable of impossible things, and capable of standing against any odds, and capable of refusing to abandon. Those who needed help, Commander Xylith joined him at viewport and stood in silence for a moment, and finally she said, "My people are alive because of yours, and we will never forget." And